worship time, and gosh, doesn't it feel good to be here? It's just being real or not being real, I guess. And looks like we're going to do a lot of things virtual before the world turns back to wherever it's going. But we're glad you're here. There are a lot of folks, if you will continue to keep in mind in your prayers, a lot of special needs and a lot of special concerns. And with school starting tomorrow, whatever that looks like and whatever that will be, keep teachers and kids and everybody in your prayer, because it will be, I'm sure, a time of adjusting. Nick and I were just talking about with all the other issues that the world is facing, we've maybe lost sight that this is probably, if you hadn't had a good garden this year, then you need to get out of the business, because this is, I've never seen rain like this in this time of year. So it's just amazing that the growing season that we've had. So in all the other issues, we certainly don't lose sight of that. Let's begin this evening with a word of prayer, and would you join us as we do so? Our Heavenly Father, we come at this juncture and this part of your day to worship you, Lord. There is something special about this place. It is, in fact, holy ground. And Lord, you make it that way because of your presence with us. We thank you for how you bless each of us. We thank you for so many good things you bring to our lives in so many ways, in so many areas of our lives. And we do just as humbly as we can thank you for those blessings. There are many special concerns. There are special needs that only you can meet and only you can take care of. And Lord, we pray that in your will, that those are accomplished and those are successful and positive to people who have those needs. Lord, we ask a blessing upon those tomorrow who start school in all the different ways that will be. For those who start their college career, for those who begin public schools and private schools, Lord, it's different. And Lord, we just pray that you would be in each and every situation. Lord, we pray especially for our country. We seem to be in disarray, but Lord, we know that you are not, and that this is your world and that we are a part of. Lord, help us even in the different world that we are a part of now. Help us to remain steadfast to you and your work. Help us to be sensitive to people who have needs that only you can fill. And Lord, may we be the conduit and the process that those blessings are brought to those individuals through us in your name, for your honor and your glory. Lord, bless our time tonight now as we study your word. Help us to glean from it what you would have us to, and help us to enjoy each other as we have that opportunity. Would you bless our time now and our efforts, for it is in your name we pray. Amen. Number 411 and number 425, we're going to sing two stanzas of 'Tis So Sweet to Trust in Jesus. That's number 411. And two stanzas of He Keeps Me Singing, and we'll sing the first and last of both. So would you stand, and would you sing, and would you worship? Now, number 425, if you prefer the hymn book, again, the first and last stanza, He keeps me singing. Again, keeping in mind the safety protocol, but let's have our time of fellowship this evening.
Well, as you're making your way back to your seats, we're going to take some prayer concerns from you and get those into the bulletin for next week. And we'll share some updates on a couple for you. And need to continue to remember Joyce Kramer. Joyce is still in the hospital. Talked with Gene just about an hour ago. And he said that she is still a very sick woman, but the doctor said that she had made a little bit of progress and in her breathing and reliance on oxygen and things like that. And so Gene is just very adamant about asking our folks to pray for her. And so just continue to pray for Joyce. Pray for Gene, because it's something else to have your spouse in the hospital and not be able to be there, not anything more than just to sit in the room with them, but to help care for them and do what you can. And so he's definitely feeling the brunt of that, as you can imagine. Also, need to remember Nancy. Talked with Ron this afternoon, just a little bit ago, and he said that she's still in a lot of pain, so remember her. They're working on the pain management, he said, and said that they would be getting some results on some biopsies maybe as early as tomorrow, and so they're looking to figure out a course of treatment going forward. And so be in prayer for them. And also need to remember Brett and his family, with Brett's father Colin passing away earlier this week. And so remember the Springall family. Any others that you have? Okay. Joyce Sheehan. Any others? Yes. Larry mentioned that yesterday, that Susie has Susie Lingle, and that's Laura's mom. Just remember her. She's at Grace Heights. Is that right? And she had COVID, and, and then was nice enough to share it with Larry and Laura and Michael and Johanna and a bunch of them. And so they've had it come through their house, or their family for sure. But she's done well with it, but has pneumonia now. So, and that's still very serious. And so she's at Grace Heights. Joyce, did you have your hand up? Okay, and the last name? Harrington. Okay. Any others? Yes. Okay. Did somebody have a Dave? I understand. Remember Tim and Barbara. Any others? Okay. Any others? Easy now. Don't you be doing that in here. We'll send you out that door. I'm gonna have to preach with my mask on because of you, Rob. I can't. No. You wouldn't expect anything less from me, would you? Yeah. Somebody got the thermometer around here. We'll have to. There you go. Instead of like in those old westerns where everybody pulls out a gun at one time, there's going to be about 15 thermometers pointing at him, right? So.
Don't use that excuse. Just tell me to go.
Well, Rob, I was hoping you'd read between the lines. No. It's too late. We're all sick. Good job, Rob. Yeah. Any other prayer concerns?
We called an epidemic.
Terry, can you not do nothing with your brother? All right. Any other prayer concerns before we get too far off track? All right. I'm going to ask you to remember Misty. Tomorrow starts her third week working full time again, and she's just, by the end of the week and the weekend, she just wore out. I mean, it's just a matter of still working on her stamina. And so she's at home this evening, but it's just come Friday she comes home and she's ready to go to bed about 7:30. And so it's just if you've ever had heart-related issues or major things like that, it's just a matter of recouping your stamina and strength, and she's doing great. She took about a month to work during the month of July part time, and then we went on vacation and then come back and she went full time. And so for the past 2 weeks, she's worked full time at the office. And so just continue to remember her, and she's doing well. Other than that, she has a doctor's appointment, I think, on Tuesday. And so we're going to go to the cardiologist. And they told her a couple months ago that from all the scans and stuff, that if you didn't know she had 4 stents in her heart, you wouldn't know anything was wrong with her heart, because the scans all come up perfectly clear. So that's good, and we're expecting more good news or similar news on Tuesday or Thursday of this week when we go to the cardiologist. So, well, with that being shared, let's turn to the end of Nehemiah chapter 12. That's where we're going to be finishing up tonight. We're going to start at the end of chapter 12, beginning with verse 44, because the last few verses of Nehemiah 12 actually go better from a Bible study perspective with chapter 13. And so tonight is the end of our study in the book of Nehemiah. Just to give you a little bit of a heads up on where we're going from here in our Sunday night series, between now and about the third or the fourth week in September, we've got kind of a choppy schedule because of holidays and trying to find a rhythm. We're going to just have 3 studies, 3 Bible studies between now and then, just regular Bible studies. It won't be a series or anything like that during that time period. We'll just do individual Bible studies that night. Or of a night. But once we get past the timing of homecoming and things like that, we're going to start into a 3-part Bible study series on cults. We're going to look at the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses, not necessarily in that order. We're going to look at the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses and look at it from a standpoint of not trying to learn every last thing that they believe. We'll sort of brush through what they believe. But the very last study in each of those groups is going to be looking at how to witness to them, how to share Christ with them. And so that's sort of where we'll go from there. But we will talk about their beliefs and things like that. The third group that we will look at, we're going to do from a investigative perspective almost. We're going to take what we know about what it means to be a cult, and then we're going to apply it to this group of individuals, and we're going to make the determination at the end: is this a true Christian denomination, or is this a cult? And so I'll leave that for when we get to that, just sort of as a bit of a teaser. And then once we get past the Christmas, Thanksgiving season, come January, we're going to start a lengthy Sunday night study in the book of Revelation. And the thing that we're going to do is we're going to work through a study that I have taught before, and we're going to make it available to where you can purchase for probably $10 the commentary that I use. It was written by Tim LaHaye, the gentleman who wrote the Left Behind series, and he does a really fantastic job of explaining the book of Revelation. And I'll be honest with you, before I found out I had this gold mine in my office years ago, I'd never studied the book of Revelation. Thought it was all signs and symbols and things that we just can't understand. So I was like most Christians. I just sort of didn't study it. I read through it, but it didn't make a whole lot of sense. But Tim LaHaye does a great job of walking you through the book of Revelation. And the study will include not only that book, we'll get you that book, but we'll also get you a 3-ring binder to put your notes in, because we'll have notes each night that we'll go through to teach from the book of Revelation. And so it will be something tangible that you can keep with you and go back and make reference to in Sunday school, or if you have questions. And the reason we do this sort of stuff is to prepare us for those God moments where God sort of ordains the conversation for us, and we get the opportunity to speak about him. And here is my example from the book of Revelation. As a pastor, you always get, well, pastor, let me ask you a question type questions. Well, I was sitting in the dentist chair earlier this week, and the lady who cleans our teeth, for me and the boys, been going to this dentist forever, and the lady, she's a believer, and she and I have had great conversations over the, 15 years or whatever she's worked there. And so as we were talking, she asked me, she said, talked about, some of the chaos that's going on in the world today. And she said, well, let me ask you about the mark of the beast and da-da-da-da and all this. And she asked me a couple of questions, just generic questions. I said, well, let me tell you, I've done some study in the book of Revelation, and only because of this study that we're going to start in January. And I told her, I said, you don't have to worry anything about the mark of the beast because of microchips and all this other stuff that people talk about. I said, because if you're a Christian, like you and I are, I said, you don't have to worry about anything because the next thing on the calendar in the Bible is the rapture. And that's when the church is taken out of the earth. After that starts the tribulation. And during the tribulation is when the Antichrist comes to power, and that's when the mark of the beast is made, and the false prophet, and the 2 witnesses, and the 144,000 Jewish evangelists, and all this. We're talking about this. So you ain't got anything to worry about. She's like, well, that puts my mind at ease, and and that ended the conversation. I had no reason to be talking about the book of Revelation while she's in there, digging around in my mouth. But, it came up in that conversation. So the good thing about this study is it will help you. The more you read through the book and study through the book, it will help you understand what you're reading in the book of Revelation. And it will be, as easily as I just talked about it, it's not because I'm a pastor that I could tell you those things that easily. It's because I've studied through that study several times teaching it. And so I love to teach the book of Revelation. It's by far one of my favorite books to study because it shows us a little bit of our history, but a whole lot of what's ahead of us. And how often do we know what the future holds? Not a lot. We know who holds the future, and we know that he's going to take care of us, but we don't generally have a roadmap for what tomorrow looks like. And the book of Revelation, for the most part, is a roadmap of what's going to happen after the rapture. And so I look forward to it. I really do. And so we'll have notes each week to give you for the week ahead so that you can study through the week and then come in prepared. And even if you don't, we're going to answer the questions for you. So no pop quizzes or anything like that, but we'll study through it. I look forward to it. So the only thing about it is a study through the book of Revelation takes 6 months. It's just because it's such a large book and you have to go through it at a certain pace, and you can only cover so much in a time period like we have right now. And so it will take us from January to probably, sometime into the summer to finish it. But we'll get through it, and it will help you understand the book of Revelation all the more. And so I'm looking forward to that. And after that, we'll pick up a different topic study is where we'll go. So in the next year, we're going to get through 2 studies, I guess you would say, and Revelation will be the most of it. But nevertheless, we got to finish up Nehemiah tonight, and then we'll move on into other things in the coming weeks. Now, last time when we were in this book, we saw the people moving to Jerusalem last week. We saw them doing this dedication of the wall. Some of them walking one way, and one team walking the other way. To dedicate the wall there in Jerusalem. And tonight we're going to see really Nehemiah handling all kinds of business in Jerusalem and showing how strong a leader he really is. Now I want you to look, like I said, in Nehemiah chapter 12. We're going to be in verses 44 through 47 first, and this is where we see Nehemiah administers the collections. It says, at that time, men were appointed to be in charge of the storerooms for the contributions, first fruits, and tithes. From the fields around the towns, they were to bring into the storerooms the portions required by the law for the priests and the Levites, for Judah was pleased with the ministering priests and Levites. They performed the service of their God and the service of purification, as did also the musicians and gatekeepers, according to the commands of David and his son Solomon. For long ago, in the days of David and Asaph, there had been directors for the musicians and for the songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. So in the days of Zerubbabel and of Nehemiah, all Israel contributed to the daily portions for the musicians and the gatekeepers. They also set aside the portion for the other Levites, and the Levites set aside the portion for the descendants of Aaron. So what we see is that the last few verses here of Nehemiah chapter 12 actually fit better with the beginning of chapter 13, like I said. And in verse 44, you notice that Nehemiah wrote, at that time. And in what that is in reference to was when he worked on administering the collections. The thing about it is we aren't given any external reference to when that was. We're not told it was at this particular time of this year of the king or anything like that. But what we do know is that it was in the latter days of Nehemiah's first governorship in Jerusalem. And so we know that this was sort of towards the end of his first time in office there. But Nehemiah essentially had put men in charge of the storerooms in the temple. Essentially, this would be, in the temple they had areas that were made to hold the collections, to hold the tithes, the offerings, all the things that had been given, because sometimes they gave to certain collections to provide for the priest and the Levites and the gatekeepers and the musicians. Other times they gave just their natural tithe, their normal offerings to God for him to use, or for the priest to use in sacrifices and things like that. And so these storerooms, they stored all of these provisions, and Nehemiah was a great leader, and especially from an administrative perspective, he knew how to put people in charge and find the right people to do the job. And so he put people in charge of these. Now, it tells us there that the Jews were pleased with the work of their priests and their Levites and what they were doing there, and so they were glad to contribute to the care of the priests and the Levites. And so what they did, the priests and the Levites, along with the musicians and the gatekeepers, what they did was all of them, in some form or fashion, helped to lead worship in the temple for the Jewish people. And so they did that like they had since the days of David and Solomon, some 500 years before. So to put it into perspective, David, you can always sort of time when you know a particular event in the Bible is happening around a certain time, you can sort of gauge it off of other events. Like we know that Jesus was born not at 0 BC. He's at, it's actually believed he was born at like 4 BC by our clock or calendar, so to speak. But you know that time frame, so you know that 60 years later when Paul and Peter and them were being martyred for their faith, you can sort of, the time frame. 500 or a little over 400 years before Christ was when this stuff in Nehemiah was happening, in the last parts of the 400s, right before it turns over to 300s BC. David and Solomon lived around 1000 BC. And so you know that from the time of Nehemiah back to David and Solomon, they had been following these prescribed orders of having people do these specific things for some 500 years. I mean, to put that into perspective, the new world was barely discovered 500 years ago. I mean, it puts it into a little bit of perspective for us. 1,000 years before the time of Nehemiah was when Joshua and Moses were alive, working to move the people from Egypt to the Promised Land. And so what we do know, though, from those time frames is also this, that from the time of Zerubbabel, when the Jews were released or allowed to come back from Persia, that was 100 years, give or take, before the events of Nehemiah. So for the last 100 years, from the time of Zerubbabel down to Nehemiah, all of Israel had helped to provide for the ones who led worship in the temple. That's essentially what we're seeing here, is that they were doing this for the last 100 years specifically, but they had also had this certain group helping to lead worship. Whether they were being supported by the people or not, they were helping to lead worship for the last 500 years. So let's go on and flip over into chapter 13, and we're going to look at the first 9 verses there of chapter 13. And what we see here is that Nehemiah literally cleans house. And so look at what it says there. It says, beginning in verse 1, "On that day the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found, written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, turned the cursing into a blessing. When the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent. Before this, Eliashib, the priest, had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah, and he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil prescribed for the Levites, musicians, and gatekeepers, as well as contributions for the priest. But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Sometime later, I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the room, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God with grain offerings and incense. So Nehemiah is telling us here that once again, a specific day is referenced. We don't have any real understanding of when this is, but what we know is that on this day they were reading the law, and there had been a lot of things transpired between the previous event and the reading of this law. A lot of things had happened, and that's what Nehemiah is telling us about. And what we can assume, though, is that this reading of the law was taking place on a Sabbath. I mean, that was generally when they did that. Now, during the reading of the law, they read from Deuteronomy 23. That's the reference where they read about the Ammonites and the Moabites and their inability to gather in with the Israelites in the temple or even be a part of the nation of Israel. There was the time when they were coming from Egypt to the Promised Land, and Ammon and Moab both basically turned their backs on the Israelites during the Exodus. They even hired Balaam to come and curse them, and that worked out to be a blessing for them. And so the Jews took a hardline stance about this command in Nehemiah's day, and they excluded all who were of foreign descent. And so what they did was they essentially removed all of those who did not meet the qualifications to be a part of the group of Israel there, or the group of the Jews there in Jerusalem. Now, Nehemiah mentioned how before they ever had this Sabbath reading of the Scripture and then kicked out the Ammonites and the Moabites from Israel, so to speak, before this ever happened, Eliashib, the high priest, the high priest allowed Tobiah, who was an Ammonite, to take up residence in a large storeroom in the temple. Now remember, is Tobiah a good guy or a bad guy? Tobiah is a bad guy. He's one of the guys with Sanballat who was constantly causing problems for Nehemiah. So we already know not only is he an Ammonite, but he is an enemy of the Jewish people. And so there's no reason for him to even be in Jerusalem, much less living in the Jewish temple. And so Nehemiah goes talking about how these storerooms that we had just talked about that would hold the tithes and the contributions for the worship leaders and for their sacrifices, all of a sudden this room is cleaned out and Tobiah is given it as a residence, as an apartment, essentially is what it is. And Nehemiah tells us in verse 6, making sure that people understood this didn't happen on his watch. It didn't happen while he was over in his house that all of a sudden they allowed him to do this. He was recalled to Persia, actually, by King Artaxerxes after serving as governor of Israel, or of Jerusalem, or Judah, I guess I should say, for 12 years. And so he left, and when he left, it caused a vacuum in the position of leadership over the Jewish people, and because of that, they started to fall away from God, and it ended up with them renting a room to an Ammonite who should not even be in the temple, and allowing him to have a room to stay in there. We aren't told, from a time standpoint, how long Nehemiah was gone. We don't know how long he was gone, but he did eventually ask to return to Jerusalem. And so, after arriving in Jerusalem, Nehemiah is greatly displeased, as he says. He's not happy. Can you imagine? He probably had a vein on the side of his head that was about to pop. He's just so mad he couldn't stand it. Because here he is. He comes in, and it's like they just flew stupid. It's just like they had no idea what was going on. And Nehemiah's like, "Really, guys? Can you not have watched, and followed what I told you for the little time I was gone?" But he comes back and he finds this Ammonite and this enemy of the Jewish people living in the temple. And so you got to love. Nehemiah was one of those guys that he seems like he was a very godly man, but he was also one of those no nonsense type of guys. I mean, you know, you listen to some of the things he's talked about, and you'll see this a little bit later in the rest of the study tonight. But he walks in, takes the guy's possessions out of that room and throws them out, and then has the cleaning crew come in and purify that storehouse, and then puts everything back in there that's supposed to be in there. I mean, he just walked up in the guy's room and starts throwing stuff out the door. And I mean, and rightfully so. Not that he was doing it maliciously or anything like that. There was good reason for it. The man shouldn't have even been in the temple, much less in that room. And so, you know, he had the correct items put back into that storeroom. But when we look on into verses 10 through 14, we see that Nehemiah administers the distributions for the people. Look there with me in verses 10 through 14. It says, I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, that all the Levites and musicians responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, why is the house of God neglected? Then I called them together and stationed them at their post. All Judah brought the gifts, or the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil into the storerooms. I put Shelmiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and a Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storerooms, and made Hanan, son of Zakur, the son of Mattaniah, their assistant, because they were considered trustworthy. They were made responsible for distributing the supplies to their fellow Levites. Remember me for this, my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. So, after he comes back, he finds Tobiah, one of his arch enemies, living in the temple. So he cleans house, literally, gets him out of there. And then he also finds that the Levites had not been provided for while he was gone. And so what we were talking about earlier about the people being pleased with the work of the priest and the Levites and wanting to provide for them was obviously before Nehemiah left Jerusalem and then returned. So he comes back and he finds out that, hey, you know, they've not been caring for the ones that were supposed to be leading them in worship, and due to the lack of provisions for them, the Levites and the musicians went back to working in their own fields. They couldn't stay there and starve, so they instead turned and went back and tried to provide for themselves. And Nehemiah rebuked and even questioned the officials over why the Levites were not given their portions. Why were they not being cared for? And so Nehemiah reads them the riot act over this. And, you know, Nehemiah didn't waste any time on the poor leadership that had been in place while he was gone, or the failure to do leadership while he was gone. And so instead, he immediately called the Levites and the musicians back to their post. He's like, hey, I'm back in town. We're going to take care of this. You're going to be provided for. Just get back to work. Come back and do what you're supposed to do. And so the Jews began to bring in their contributions to care for the Levites and the others that were responsible for caring for the temple, for leading worship and doing all of those things. And Nehemiah set trustworthy men over the distribution of these supplies. And ultimately he says, God, I want you to remember what I've tried to do here. You know, don't let it be forgotten. And here we are 2,400 years later, more than 24, almost 2,500 years later, talking about what he's done in trying to care for the temple there. And so God has definitely allowed us to remember what he's done. I'm sure God has as well. Now look on into verses 15 through 22 with me, and this is where we see Nehemiah lays down the law. So you can imagine this is only going to get better. You know, the man that's walking into people's apartments, throwing their stuff out of the temple, you know, it's probably only going to get more challenging. So let's look at verses 15 through 22. It says, in those days I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore, I warned them against selling food on that day. People from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your ancestors do the same thing, so that our God brought all this calamity on us and on this city? Now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath. When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors ordered to be shut and not open until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. Once or twice the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem. But I warned them and said, "Why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you." From that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember me for this also, my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. So if you remember back in Nehemiah chapter 10, the people had made this big agreement with God. We talked about it just a few chapters ago. They made this big agreement that, hey, we're going to follow the law of Moses. We're going to follow the commands that we're supposed to follow, including the ones about the Sabbath. You know, their day of rest, their day of worship. And in verse 31 of chapter 10, this is what they said. When the neighboring peoples bring merchandise or grain to sell on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on any holy day. And so you can imagine that this may have been somewhere around a decade later. We don't really know. It may have been a dozen years later for all we know. But nevertheless, during Nehemiah's absence, the Jews had once again forsaken the Sabbath, and they started treating it just like any other day. They started treating it just like it was another day of the week. And Nehemiah, as he says, saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and other kinds of loads. They were bringing all of this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath and opening up shop in the market district. And so there were even some merchants from the coastal city of Tyre, Sidon and Tyre, that you read about in the scriptures, and they actually lived in Jerusalem, and they were bringing in fish from the coast and other merchandise and selling them on the Sabbath. And so after Nehemiah finds this out, he's like, no, we're not going to have any of this. We're not going to do this. And so he goes in and he lays down the law of Moses with them again and tells them that wouldn't be allowed on the Sabbath. And he first rebuked the nobles. He first fussed at the leaders of the people because it was their responsibility to keep the people following the law of Moses. And they hadn't. They were falling into the same trap their ancestors had done about not worshiping on the Sabbath and not following God completely. And so on Friday evenings, what Nehemiah ordered was that as soon as it got close to dark, when the shadows started to hit the gate, they were to close the gate and keep them shut from Friday evening to Saturday evening for a whole 24 hours for the Sabbath. And so that was their responsibility, and he even stationed some of his own men to make sure that it got handled like he wanted it done. And what we see is that a couple of times there were some merchants came and set up camp outside the gate, waiting for the gate to open on the Sabbath, and never opened. And finally Nehemiah's like, look, if you don't leave, I'm going to arrest you. And so they ended up leaving, and after that, they didn't have any more trouble out of that. But what he did do was he, in his administrative mindset, had the Levites to go and purify themselves and then take over guarding the gate that people were coming in on the Sabbath, so that they, as spiritual leaders in Israel, could help keep the Sabbath day holy inside the city of Jerusalem. Now, what we see here in the next text, which is our final text of the night and of the book, is from verses 23 through 31, and we see once again that Nehemiah is laying the law down again for the people. So look with me at verses 23 through 31. It says, "Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, or the language of one of the other places, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, 'You are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves.' Was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among the many nations there was no king like him. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. But even he was led into sin by foreign women. Must we hear now that you too are doing all this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women? One of the sons of Joiada, son of Eliashib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite, and I drove him away from me. Remember them, my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. So I purified the priests and the Levites of everything foreign and assigned them duties, each to his own task. I also made provision for contributions of wood at designated times and for the first fruits. And his final words written in his memoirs was, "Remember me with favor, my God." So you remember, we just talked about it just a second ago. Back in chapter 10, the people had this moment of conscience, this moment where they wanted to get back to God. They make this big agreement that they're going to follow the law of Moses just like they should have from the very beginning. And one of those commands that they agreed to follow back in chapter 10 specifically was the prohibition of intermarrying with the surrounding Gentile nations. They agreed not to marry with the foreign peoples around them. And in verse 30 of chapter 10, this is what they said. It says, "We promise not to give our daughters in marriage to the peoples around us or to take their daughters for our sons." And again, 10, 12 years later, Nehemiah is back in Jerusalem after an absence, and the Jews had once again fell into their old ways while Nehemiah's strong leadership presence was missing. And so when Nehemiah returned, he found that the Jews had intermarried with the women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Now, Ashdod was one of the Philistine cities. And so this was people that were essentially to the west of Israel. The Ammonites and the Moabites were sort of to the east and south of Jerusalem and Israel. And so it was bad enough that they had broken God's commands, that they weren't following his commands, but half of the kids from these marriages didn't even speak the Hebrew language. They spoke their mother's mother tongue. And so they didn't speak Hebrew, and this sort of thing is one of the things that led the Jews to end up in exile in Assyria for the 10 northern tribes, and for Judah and Benjamin for them to end up in Babylon. This was part of what happened that caused the downfall of the Jewish people. And so Nehemiah took this very, very seriously. He knew that, he even used King Solomon as an example. Look what happened to Solomon. And he was the wisest king ever. He was loved by God and all of these things. And he still messed up. He still followed these foreign women away from God. And so Nehemiah is making a strong case for this. And so in verse 25, it says that he rebuked them and called down curses on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name. Man, Nehemiah, he's not playing, is he? I mean, he's beating them and then pulling out their hair. It was primarily the beard hair that they would be pulling. And that was a sign of contempt. I mean, it was like, you knew somebody meant business when they were. Somebody come pulling my beard hair out, I don't know they mean business, but this was a cultural thing at that time, and Nehemiah he wasn't holding back. I mean, he was literally laying the law, smacking them down with the law. But nevertheless, their oath that he has them to take is very similar to the oath that they took back in chapter 10. Now, the straw that broke the camel's back for Nehemiah is the fact that one of the high priests, Eliashib, the same guy who let Tobiah take up an apartment inside the temple, Eliashib is the high priest, the grand poobah, so to speak, of the Jewish faith at this time with Nehemiah there. Eliashib had one of his grandsons, or allowed one of his grandsons to marry a Gentile woman. And so this caused a lot of problems. The main problem it was for what it did to the priestly line and the high priestly line. And so this defiled this family line of the priests from Aaron, but it also made a mockery of God's law, because here the high priest was sort of turning his back on the laws of Moses and saying, well, it's okay for me to give a pass here, but everybody else needs to follow God's law. And so it was this contradiction in terms, so to speak, of what was going on. And to make matters even worse, it's like when you think, can things get any worse? Well, yeah, it got even worse, because the grandson had married the daughter of Sanballat, the guy who has given Nehemiah a fit for chapters in this book, who was trying to assassinate him potentially, who was threatening an attack with others against Jerusalem. And here the high priest, after 10 or 12 years, has just sort of turned his back on what had happened and the danger that this brought, not only the spiritual danger, but the physical danger it brought for the Jewish people. I mean, this was one of the Jews' biggest adversaries at this time. And so there was only two things that Nehemiah could do. And so the first thing he did was he exiled the grandson from the nation of Israel. He exiled him because he was married to Sanballat's daughter. And then the other thing he did was he had the priests and the Levites set things back in order, did their purification, and got everything squared away for that. And as I said a minute ago, the last words we hear from Nehemiah is that God would remember him with favor. And that was what he just wanted to do, what God wanted done. And I've tried to find a little bit about what could have happened to Nehemiah after the last of these pages, and we know nothing. What we do know is that this time frame, when Nehemiah left, when he left to go back to Persia, would have been around 433 BC. Somewhere around in there, 431 BC, somewhere around in there. And in 407, one of those archaeological evidences that we talked about at the very beginning of this study, way back when, the Elephantine Papyrus, tells that there was a different man as governor in Judah in the year 407 BC. So at some point between 407 BC and 431-ish BC, Nehemiah leaves, goes back to Persia, and then comes back and does all that we read about in verse 13, and then he just sort of goes off of the world stage. We don't know what happens to him. And so he could have went back to Persia, he could have stayed in Judah, we just don't know. But to round out this study, as we've done each night, we're going to look real quickly at the hand of the Lord in this situation and how the Lord has worked. And the way we can see the hand of the Lord in this chapter is through the strong spiritual leadership of Nehemiah. We can imagine that he was gone for a few years, as I said, maybe as much as 8, 10, 12 years, but we're not certain of the time frame. But what is certain is that it didn't take long for the Jewish people to fall away from God and to, without that strong spiritual influence in their lives. They fell away very quickly. But without the strong influence of this leadership, the Jewish people, they just wandered. They wandered from God. But when Nehemiah was there to lead and be that strong leadership presence that they needed from a spiritual standpoint, even though he wasn't the high priest, even though he wasn't Ezra the scribe, he still had this heart for the people's spiritual nature. And so when he was there to lead, the people would follow God completely. He led them in that direction. And that's why we need leaders to do those sort of things. Now, how we see the hand of the Lord in the same way today is in the strong spiritual leadership that God provides through leaders in our churches today. Not just here at Oak Ridge, but in churches all across the world. One thing that is, I know it's sad from the church member's perspective, but from a pastor's perspective, one of the things that is sad to see in the world today is when a church has a strong spiritual leader, someone that in the pulpit leading the church, and maybe does so for decades at times, but then either they move on or God moves them or they retire or something along those lines, and then you see that it's just like after him, they start to flounder and make poor choices and poor decisions. And it's just, it's one of those things that just breaks your heart when you see such a strong collection of believers, start to struggle after that vacuum is caused by the absence of a strong spiritual leader. And the good thing is that churches like Oak Ridge and others have strong spiritual leadership even outside of the pulpit. That's one of the things that I have noticed and has just always has caught my attention from the very first conversations that I had with our search committee that ended up bringing me here or leading in this direction is the strong leadership outside of the pulpit that our church has. And I wish other churches I have served in had the same kind of strong leaders in positions of leadership in the church. And, this strong leadership also helps the people by making sure that the leadership in the pulpit is the leadership that the church needs. And so it's not just a matter of, we blindly follow the pastor and he does all the leading and everything like that. Yes, there is times when the pastor has to be that person and lead and do in certain directions. But the great thing is that we have strong leadership, not only in our church, but in a lot of churches, that help to lead. And so what happens is when you have that strong leadership in the church, whether it's in the pulpit or in the pews, the good thing is that you don't have as many cases where there is that void left by the strong leader, and the church sort of flounders and has problems. And so it's good when we have in our churches strong leaders to help lead, even in the absence of a pastor, or to help facilitate the leadership of the pastor. And so it's always good to have that. And so that is the end of our study in the book of Nehemiah. I hope that it's helped you to grow and helped you to learn. And as I said, over the next few weeks, we'll have a couple of different just regular Bible studies on Sunday night, different topics, different things. And then we'll get into our series on, I think we start with the Jehovah's Witnesses, if I remember right. But we'll do the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons. And as I said, we'll look at those things and go forward from there. And so with that being said, we'll ask Ken if he'll close us with a word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed.